going to discuss Chapter 2, the Founding and the Constitution. So that starts on page 28 in your book if you want to follow along while we discuss everything. So let's just go ahead and dive in, shall we? Let me take the PowerPoint and make sure it's full screen for you guys. All right, you should be able to see everything now. Hopefully you can see me over in the side. I know like that helps for some people and some people it doesn't. So, but hopefully that makes it a little easier. So we are going to kick off chapter 2. Hopefully you guys are getting the information okay. According to the grades I have so far, everybody seems to be grasping the material well, which is fantastic. I emailed the people tonight who haven't submitted anything yet. There's no rush and nothing is due until Sunday, but I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that there were assignments that were due on Sunday because I have to enter no-show grades by next Tuesday. And since it's an online class, the way we do that is by submitted assignments. So I have to have something in from each of you to make sure to not mark you as a no-show. So a lot of you have submitted stuff, which is great. All of the people who've submitted have actually submitted the syllabus quiz, the 2 online quizzes, and at least through the chapter 1 quiz, which is terrific. So one of the students has actually already submitted all of the work for the week. So their job is now to just study for the exam next week, which is incredibly impressive. I don't know where they found the time. That's terrific. Hopefully that person takes a good nap before delving into more information. So yeah, for those of you who have started, you guys are doing great. You're like right on track. You're doing exactly what you need to do. And for those who haven't submitted anything, just make sure that you are prepared and to like get done in time. I mean, we're only halfway through the first week, so you still have plenty of time. Okay. So we're going to talk about the founding. You know, last week we sort of talked about the basics, the basic definitions of, you know, our government setup. We talked about liberty, equality, and democracy, and we talked about political knowledge quite a bit and being involved as a voter. And so now we're going to sort of backtrack and talk about how we got started and the whys of why we broke away from Britain. So a lot of this is going to feel like old hat for those of you who've had like US history recently, because you discussed some of this already in a history class. But for some of you, it may have been a while, or maybe you didn't discuss it as well or in as much detail possibly. So we always go over this just to be sure we're all on the same page. So we had the American Revolution after the colonies pretty much got fed up with Britain for a number of reasons, which we'll be talking about soon. So it was basically several different struggles that colonies were having and different things that were of similar interest for them that they felt they were not able to achieve by being under Britain's rule anymore. Sorry. And they felt as though they weren't being heard. And they were just being ignored by Britain as well. So there were 5 different sections of society that really kind of made up the colonies. So you had your New England merchants, who are exactly what it sounded like. And then we also had your Southern planters, royalists, people who had royal land, who held offices, who owned patents for creation. So kind of your top dogs, I guess you could say. The shopkeepers, artisans, laborers, sort of like the middle group of folks. And then small farmers, in addition to planters, because there were farmers like north and south. Oh, gracious, so sorry. So those are the 5 different groups of people who had beef basically with Britain. So during the first half of the 1900s, or 1900s, gracious, the 1700s, Britain ruled the American colonies, but they did so pretty lightly. They didn't really get a lot of involvement. They kind of let them do their own thing. There wasn't a whole lot that that the colonists had to do to appease Britain. However, when the French and Indian War happened, Britain ended up taking on quite a bit of debt due to that because of obviously having to send troops over. That's quite costly when you don't have when you don't have, you know, like the modern means of transportation that we have now through like airplanes and stuff, right? So so it's time consuming, costly, you know, the supplies, the troops, all of that stuff. So they ended up getting in a lot of debt as a result of that. So as a result, Britain had to spend money to protect the colonies because remember, they're just an extension of Britain at this time. So like they didn't have their own military, they didn't have their own support system as a means of defense if people tried to come over and say, no, I think we're going to take over now, you know, kind of like how we did with the Native Americans. So, so that became an issue because Britain felt like, okay, now they're spending more money on the colonists and they wanted to be able to recoup that money. So they started levying taxes on the colonists in a way that they hadn't. So the first one was known as the Sugar Act of 1764. So they taxed sugar, molasses, and any and other commodities that were shipped over from Britain to the colonies that the colonies didn't have as much access to at the time. And then in 1765, they created the Stamp Act, which required all printed materials to have a stamp on them because, you know, they had a lot of family back home, right? Like the colonists left a lot of people behind. So there was a lot of like letter writing that was going back and forth by water. And so they created like what we still have basically with the Postal Service is, you know, is a stamp. So like, so that's money, right? That's more money out of their pocket that they have to pay to Britain. Oh my gracious, I apologize. And that obviously like did not go over well. So on page 31, it talks about the Stamp Act and it says, united under the slogan, no taxation without representative, England merchants and Southern planters ended up breaking with royalist allies and turned to their former adversaries, shopkeepers, small farmers, laborers, and artisans for help in opposing the tax measures. So, so they were not happy with that because the New England merchants and the Southern planters were the ones who were affected the most because they were involved the most in needing these items. So they were taxed the most. So of course they were upset about that. So that became a big problem. So they, you know, they pushed back. They were like, listen, we have no representation back home. You guys are just starting to like dictate things to us, but we don't have any say. We don't have any sort of like voting power in this. And you're just sort of, you know, bossing us around and we don't like it. So, you know, you can understand where Britain was coming from in the sense that like, hey, we got to get this money from somewhere. Like you can't get, you can't get blood from a turnip type of thing. And the same is true in this instance too, just like with our current government, right? Like people say, well, where's that money is coming from? Taxes, right? Like we pay for all the stuff that the government needs to do. Like that comes down in different ways. So, so all of those different groups kind of came together though and said, listen, man, like we're still just getting started here and it's costly for us to be over here too. And now it's going to cost us even more. So they eventually did push. Whew. I am so very sorry. I'm not even gonna lie. I had to start this video late because of the munchkin and just the day. Like there just wasn't another time to do it. So I'm so very sorry. You guys would not get as much of this. Well, I'd like to say that, but if we were face to face, but I can't guarantee that either. I probably should have chugged down some Coca-Cola or something, a little energy drink or something. So Britain finally did give in based on the pushback that they were getting and the complaints that they were getting from folks in Boston and from just like everybody in the colonies, right? So they did rescind most of the taxes. Merchants and planters were still anxious to about the whole situation, but they kind of wanted to drop it. Like they wanted to end the unrest. They were not comfortable with upsetting the motherland, as it were. But other people were not satisfied, and they were still pushing for like a larger change than what they were seeing. So, you know, your book discusses how, you know, British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre that killed 5 colonists by British soldiers who were attempting to repel an angry mob gathered outside the townhouse, really worked folks up. So the soldiers were defended by John Adams, a pillar of Boston society and a future president of the United States. Adams asserted that soldiers' actions were entirely justified, provoked by a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes. This is how it's quoted in your book. Irish Teagues and outlandish Jack Tars, which are all rude words to describe people. All but 2 of the soldiers were acquitted. Despite efforts of the British government and the colonial elite, however, it proved difficult to end the political strife. Under leadership that included Samuel Adams, a cousin of John Adams, the more radical forces asserted that British power supported an unjust political and social structure within the colonies, and they soon advocated for an end to British rule. So then things get kind of testy later on in Boston, and we have what everybody is familiar with from history class, the Boston Tea Party. So, of course, disagreements about multiple things, but specifically taxation was one that kept firing people up. And in 1773, the British government enacted the Tea Act. So it says here, with the Tea Act, the British government granted the politically powerful East India Company a monopoly on the export of tea from Britain, eliminating a lucrative trade for colonial business interests. So instead of offering that business to their own people, they went outside of their group. I mean, they had, this time, like British rule had colonies all over the place. So they probably had colonies in India as well. But so the colonists were upset, like, listen, like we can make our own tea. Like, what are you doing? And so they did not want that tea from the East India Company. So Samuel Adams stirred the pot and rallied his people who were itching for more change, and they protested it. So they disguised themselves as Native Americans, which is offensive, right? Not cool, but they did it so they could hide their own identities. They ended up boarding 3 British ships that had the tea for the import. And they threw all of the cargo into the Boston Harbor, which we're all familiar with. And that led to the British blockading Boston altogether. So this image is on page 32. It says the British helped radicalize colonists through bad policy decisions in the years leading up to the revolution. For example, Britain gave the ailing East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade in the American colonies. Colonists feared that monopoly would hurt colonial merchants' business and protested by throwing the tea into the harbor. So, you know, as a Southerner, I'm offended because you know how we are about our sweet tea, but you know, they got worked up, right? So a lot of fit throwing happened, really, like that. Like the Boston Tea Party is kind of a glorified temper tantrum to some extent, but they were trying to make their voices heard, so they protested. This isn't what I would have called a completely peaceful protest. They damaged property of other people, right? But a protest nonetheless. So that's how they sort of aired their grievances. So the merchants had hoped that the British would rescind the Tea Act, but they didn't want to seek independence at this time from Britain. Adams and the other radicals hoped to provoke the British into actions that would alienate colonial supporters and pave the way for a full-on rebellion. And that plan pretty much succeeded. Parliament enacted a number of harsh reprisals, including closing the port of Boston to commerce, changing the colonial government of Massachusetts, removing accused persons to Britain for trial, and most importantly, restricting colonist movement to the West. Further alienating the Southern planters who depended on access to new Western lands. So, you know, they poked the bear poked back. So the colonists are like, nope, we done. That's the final straw. We're not doing it. Like, you're way over there. You have no idea what it's like to settle this new land. Like, you guys are all established. Like, we're in completely uncharted territory here. So in 1776, they said, boo to you, and had the Second Continental Congress. We had already had one sort of meeting of the minds to, you know, get a little organized as like colonies. And then we had the Second Continental Congress, which appointed people to write a letter to Britain saying, you know what, we've had it. we're done. So the people on that committee were Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, John Adams, and Robert Livingston. So, which were all like the top dogs at the time, like, you know, pretty big wig people, as it were. So, so they ended up writing the Declaration of Independence, which a really good way to think about the Declaration of Independence is it's like the best breakup letter ever, right? It, like, they were very much like Taylor Swift, we are never, ever, ever getting back together, like ever. It's not me, it's you. So it was definitely like a, we're done with you. We are gonna strike it out on our own. And Britain was like, excuse me, this is our land. Like, we're just letting you be on it, which is the most absurd thing ever, because really it was nobody's land but the Native Americans. But, you know, nobody asked my opinion. So, so the Declaration of Independence was considered to be two parts, one philosophical and one political. So the philosophical part, they list talking about how certain rights are given to all people, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, they use that in what ends up becoming like the Constitution stuff. They use that to help them when it comes time for the Bill of Rights. And the second part is a political document. They explain why they rebelled against Great Britain, why they're kind of sick of the back and forth, and why they want to break away and govern themselves. They focused on different grievances that they had with Britain, goals that they had as colonies, and principles that they felt embodied the colonists that they felt like Britain was not embodying. So it helped also unify colonists with those different interests and principles. So I want to say, I think the Declaration of Independence wording is in the back of your book. I'm going to double check real quick. I know that there are several documents in the back of your book, which is fantastic. Articles of Confederation. Here we go. Declaration of Independence. Now, I'm not going to read this entire thing to you because like we ain't got time for that, right? But it is in the back of your book. It's the first thing in the appendix under A1. So I'll just read just like the very beginning here. So the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Doesn't that sound like a breakup? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain and unalienable rights, that these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that the governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So yada, yada, yada. Let me see. The history of the present king of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and I'm going to butcher this word, usurpations. I don't think that's right. It might be usurpations. And it might not be any of those. All having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted into a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. He has refused to pass other laws for accommodation of large districts of people. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distance from public records. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly. He's refused for a long time to cause others to be elected. And it goes on and on and on. He's like, they're just like, we're done. Like the king has just continued to make our lives a ruddy hell. So I do highly recommend like reading this because the Declaration of Independence is one of the most beautiful letters, like, and so well done. But it really is a breakup letter. Like 4th of July, they're like, we're done, boo-boo. And of course, like this is pretty timely considering the 4th of July is coming up soon, next week after next. So in like 2 weeks, maybe not even a full 2 week, like a week and a half or whatever, we've got the 4th of July. So, so I definitely recommend reading the Declaration of Independence. Also in your appendix is the Articles of Confederation, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then the entirety of the Constitution, and then the amendments, which would be like it's all of the amendments. Then the Federalist Papers, which are papers we'll be talking about in Chapter 3. And then the Anti-Federalist Papers, which we'll also be talking about in Chapter 3. So, and it's just a sampling. I don't believe it's not all of the letters. It's just a few of them to kind of give you an idea of what they were. So definitely if you have time or can make time, read those in the back. it gives a really good kind of full view of everything. So after they broke up with Britain, then they were like, okay, well, now that we've done this thing, we've got to actually create some form of government, right? So we don't have like anarchy and chaos. So they decide on creating something called the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation are basically like the first Constitution, like the first draft of the Constitution. It wasn't called the Constitution, it's called the Articles of Confederation, but that's basically what it was. It was like a first draft because they had to end up going back to the drawing board. So it is considered America's first written constitution. Make note of that in your head. You will see that again. What was America's first written constitution? Articles of Confederation. You'd be amazed at the people that say Declaration of Independence, and it hurts my soul. It's not. It's the Articles of Confederation. It served as the basis for America's national government until 1789. So from 1777 to 1789. So, a good run, 12 years. That's not terrible, right? For like a first try. We had a lot of issues. Eventually ratified by all the states, it functioned as the country's constitution until the final months of 1788. So 7 years of like everybody kind of being like, yeah, okay, we're good. So their biggest thing was they did not want the central government, which is like the federal government, like they didn't want the top dogs to have too much power because they were afraid of having another system like they had with Britain, and they did not want like a king like dictatorship. They just did not want the government to have so much power that the people felt like they had no control and couldn't do what they needed to do. So they gave most of the power in the Articles of Confederation to the states. So your book says the first goal was to limit powers of central government. Under Article 2, it says each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. These attributes define a confederation. So the definition of confederation is a system of government in which states retain sovereign authority, except for the powers expressly delegated to the national government. Given that there was no president or other presiding officer, the entire national government consisted of a Congress that had been given very little power. Its members were little more than messengers from the state legislators. Their salaries were paid out of the state treasury. They were subject to immediate recall by state authorities, and each state, regardless of its population, had only one vote. All 13 states had to agree for any amendments to the Articles of Confederation after it was ratified. And of course, that became very problematic, right? Because think about it. If you have 13 people in a room, those 13 people won't be able to agree on what pizza to order, let alone let's change our governing document, right? Like, so things just were not functional as a result, right? Like things just didn't get done. And then there was no like top dog to look to in times of crisis because they didn't want a president. They didn't want like a number one leader because they were afraid that it would turn into them basically appointing a king. George Washington, as you know, was the first president, and he was sometimes referred to as like kind of like King George because of how new the system was, but he made it very clear that that was not his intent. That was not how he was going to govern. And we'll get into more of that later, like in ways that he sort of like established precedent as the president that people have followed since. So with the exception of pretty much one instance. So see, Congress was able to declare war and make peace, to make treaties and alliances, issue currency, borrow money, and regulate trade with Native Americans. But all laws had to be carried out by state governments. Senior officers of the U.S. Army could be appointed by Congress, but there was no army because the nation's armed forces consisted only of state militia. These limitations on the power for national government made it hopelessly impractical to maintain. So, I mean, it sounded great, right? Like, hey, we're not going to, we're not going to micromanage you, and we're just going to let you do your thing. Well, that sounds great, but that's like giving, a 16-year-old keys to a car and say, I'll let you decide when you want to come home, and if you need anything for us, we're here. How does that work, right? Like, just make good choices. But like when they have no boundaries, like they get their first speeding ticket, they get in a car accident, they stay out too late, they get in trouble, they go to the wrong party, whatever. So same kind of concept, like all the states were sort of left to their own devices. So there was like no unity. It was like 13 separate countries in some ways. So that became a very big problem. So we had a weak central government as a result. So like if you were to see, I don't know, something that says compare the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, or what makes it different, weak central government would be something that you would list under the Articles of Confederation. Because we had no president, only a legislator, and it was impractical, right? Like you would never get all 13 to agree on things. And it doesn't take into account population size. So New Jersey gets one vote. Real estate. Virginia gets one vote. So a lot of people had trouble with that because for like New Jersey, that seemed more fair, right? Because they don't have as large a population. For Virginia, it's like, but we have more people. Like we have different concerns. Like we should not it shouldn't be equal in that respect. So that ends up getting addressed in the Constitution. So there were some other things. I mentioned there was no military to protect folks, just state militia. So then each state has to say, okay, let's rally the troops. And what are the odds that all 13 are going to agree to do something like that? Taxes were done at the state level. Federal government could not, force taxes, and therefore couldn't raise money to do things like make roads and, expand anything really. So it was a problem because, we didn't have, it was kind of like organized chaos. Like we didn't really have like a good system to be able to actually get things done and to grow like we needed to. So like the national government couldn't even stop a state from competing with other states for overseas commerce. So because they sort of acted as their own entities, like if Florida wanted to trade with France, but so did Alabama, they could, try and outbid each other and screw over the other state. Whereas with our current system, only the national government can trade with foreign commerce. Like states cannot, they can't make treaties, they can't negotiate things like that, because that could end up being an issue and was. So some leaders were concerned about the Articles of Confederation because they felt like, I don't know, man, like it doesn't seem like it covers all the bases. Like, I don't know that it's going to be good enough for our long-term goals. They were worried about foreign affairs, right? They couldn't enforce treaties with other places. A new treaty, for example, was needed with the British to cover disputes left over from the war. But who's going to negotiate that, right? Like each of the 13 states can't make separate deals with Britain. And then British government said it would negotiate with all 13 states separately. However, that becomes super cumbersome. And what if like one state gets a better deal than another state? Like, like logistically, it just didn't make sense. So, they're like, I just don't know if this is going to work. Like I'm concerned about how effective this is going to be. So the Virginia state legislator actually called for a conference of the other states and said, listen, I think we need to make some changes. So they met in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786 to be like, hey, I think we need to do some amendments. Like, we all need to get on the same page. Like, I think we've got some gaps that are going to cause problems. So delegates from 5 of the 13 states came to the convention. The decision was made to meet 1 year later in Philadelphia to try and get the rest of the states together. And basically, it was the first of a few steps to, kind of do a second founding and go back to the drawing board. Before they could get to that point, a group of scrappy farmers led by a man named Daniel Shea took some matters in their own hands. So there was a rebellion. It's called Daniel Shea's Rebellion. It provided the Articles of Confederation were too weak to protect the fledgling nation. So what happened was, in the winter following the Annapolis Convention, Daniel Shays, a former Army captain, led a mob of debt-ridden farmers in an effort to prevent foreclosures on their land by keeping the county courts of Western Massachusetts from sitting until after the next election. Because what happened under these states was states could levy whatever taxes they wanted to. There's nobody to check and balance them and to say, hey man, it's too much. You're doing too much to them and they can't afford it. Like, you got to slow your roll. And so they were taxing people out of their property, and then the state would acquire it. And so Daniel Shays and his buddies were like, negative ghostwriter, we are not having this. So so they ended up creating a mob and pushing back against the state government. So the state governor organized a militia and funded a group of prominent merchants to disperse the mob, but Shea and his followers attempted to capture the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts. Within a few days, the state government regained control and captured 14 of the rebels. Later that year, a newly elected Massachusetts legislator granted some of the farmers' demands. George Washington actually said that he was mortified beyond expression that in the moment of our acknowledged independence, we should by our conduct verify the predictions of the transatlantic foe, which is Britain and other countries saying they're going to fall on their face, and render ourselves ridiculous and contemptible in the eyes of all Europe, because a handful of farmers basically overthrew the government. Congress under the Confederation had shown itself unable to act decisively in a time of crisis, providing critics of the articles with precisely the evidence they needed to push the Annapolis Resolution through the Congress. Thus, the states were asked to send representatives to Philadelphia to discuss constitutional revision. Delegates were eventually sent by every state except Rhode Island, those troublemakers there. So, so they were like, yeah, okay, if a group of farmers can overturn us, then clearly our system is not set up in the way it needs to be. So good on Daniel Shays and his merry men, right? Little Robin Hood-esque feel, if you ask me. Not that they were robbing from the rich to give to the poor, but sort of, right? Like the rich government to save themselves, who were the poor. So so they just couldn't manage it at that level anymore. So they met back at Philadelphia, and that led to what was known as the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So they focused on a couple of different things. One was economic interest. They knew that they had to think about their economic future and prosperity, and how are we going to rise to the challenge of being taken seriously across Europe and the rest of the world without making all of our citizens like penny poor, right? So they sought to create a new government that promoted Congress and protected people's personal property so they could have a good balance. And then they also focused on political principles. The new Constitution focused on limited government, but strong government, separation of power, so there's checks and balances, and individual liberties. So remember, that's that whole civil liberties, freedom from government interference. So they talked about that quite a bit at the convention in Philadelphia. So depending on what state you were from, there were different ideas as to how to rebuild Congress. Okay. So larger states were like, listen, we have a lot of people and it should be based on population because we need to be able to represent all the head count in our state. Well, smaller states were like, well, that's not fair, man. We're a smaller chunk of land. It wasn't divided equally and we don't have as many people. Of course, now, I don't know, New Jersey is pretty crowded. Like, I'd be interested to see like the population between Jersey and like, Virginia now or whatever. So, so Edmund Randolph was the one who came up with Virginia's idea, which became known as the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan is a framework for the Constitution introduced by Mr. Randolph that called for representation in the national legislature based on the population of each state. The portion of each state's revenue contribution to the national government, or both, like whichever, either or both, like we're happy with either of those. Opponents said that it was really biased in favor of larger states. Yeah, they were a large state. Of course it was. And then William Patterson proposed New Jersey Plan, which called for equal state representation in the national legislature, regardless of population. So if you know anything about the government, this should start sounding familiar to you as to what we see in Congress. So Connecticut came in and said, yo, why don't we do both? I think we can make this happen. So they created what's known as the Great Compromise. It was the agreement that was reached at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 that gave each state an equal number of senators, regardless of its population. So every state gets 2 senators. Florida has 2, Hawaii has 2, Alaska has 2, New Jersey has 2, Rhode Island, like it doesn't matter the size. Everybody gets 2 senators when they are a state. So as of right now, we have 50 states, so that's 100 senators. If we ever, for whatever reason, acquired Puerto Rico in the sense of it becoming a state, I mean, they're already a territory of the US, but say they became a state and it was now 51 states, then we'd have 102 senators. And then the Great Compromise said, in addition to the senators, regardless of its population, it would link representation in the House of Representatives to population. So you have the number of House of Representatives members that you have in your state is solely based on your population, which is part of why we do a census. Like, we need to get a head count of how many people are in each area, so we know how funding needs to go, so we know how to allocate House of Representatives members, so we know how to redraw district boundary lines to fairly and accurately represent the population as it currently is in the state. So that's part of the reason why we have the census. We'll also talk about the census more in detail later on as well. So Senate is the New Jersey Plan portion, right? And then the House is the Virginia portion. So you will definitely want to know the term the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. You need to know that they're the same thing, which merged Virginia and New Jersey, and you need to know the Virginia and New Jersey plans. So that is how we got the 2 chambers of Congress, which are also known as a bicameral legislature because it's bi, 1, 2. So now, here's where our terrible tendencies come out, right? So people who had slaves wanted their slaves counted because that would give more bargaining power with the House of Representatives, because if they are counted as citizens, then that gives them a larger vote. Now, think about where a lot of the slaves were. Now, slaves were all over. People up north had slaves, people down south had slaves, but we had more in the south than in the north, right? Who had the larger states? The South, right? So they want more House of Representative members so they can have like even larger representation. So they pushed and said, listen, like we want our slaves counted. And the North was like, man, that's not fair. Like, we already have smaller populations because we're smaller states and we don't have nearly the amount of slaves. It's not right. So that's how they reached a compromise that enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a free person. So it says Senates in the House were apportioned by population, according to which 5 enslaved people would count as 3 free people. That's a 3/5 compromise. So 2 of the 5 don't count. But that was how they were able to get some representation for the extra, head count without getting full credit because, at the time they had no rights. They couldn't vote, they couldn't own land. They, they barely considered them to be people unless it benefited them, like the 3/5 compromise. So terribly demeaning, horrible, people suck. So this picture says, despite the founders' emphasis on liberty, the new Constitution allowed slavery, counting 3/5 of all enslaved people and apportioning seats in the House of Representatives. In the 1792 painting, Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences, the books, instruments, and classical columns at the left contrast with the kneeling slave people at the right, illustrating the divide between America's rhetoric of liberty and equality and the reality of slavery, which gave those individuals neither liberty nor equality. So there's that. Let me check something real quick. Okay. So while they were trying to build a new constitution and sort of like redirect the government from the first constitution, which was the Articles, to this newer, more organized, stronger government. So the framers wanted to achieve several things. They knew they needed stronger central government because they didn't need a bunch of farmers just throwing the whole thing upside down on a whim, right? They needed something more organized than that. So it needed to be strong enough to promote commerce within the states as well as, like negotiating with things internationally, but still protect, people's personal property. They also wanted to do what's known as preventing excessive democracy, which your book says it says the framers wanted to prevent what they saw as the threat posed by excessive democracy of both state and national governments under the Articles of Confederation, which is, not enough checks and balances. That's basically what that boils down to. Like, the states had so much power and then the national government had no power. And so it just wasn't very well balanced. So that's part of the bicameral system in the chamber and created the checks and balances system. So see, we've already talked about the bicameral and the 3/5 compromise. So on page 39, it also has the definition for checks and balances, which is mechanisms through which each branch of government is able to participate in and influence the activities of other branches. Major examples include the presidential veto power over congressional legislation, the power of the Senate to approve presidential appointments. Sorry. And judicial review of congressional enactments. So everybody checks everybody, right? So like no one group in the government can get over and do whatever they want. So they wanted to make sure that they included ideas in the Constitution that would generate public support, because they knew if the public did not support this change, it would all kind of fall apart. So they wanted to make sure there was also restraint on federal government from taking away people's individual liberties, which they felt like Britain kind of trampled on. And so they didn't want to do that as a new government. They wanted to make sure the citizens felt like they had some level of autonomy. So we already went through that. Oh, and then they talked about the fact that, okay, well, we don't really want it, but I think we got to have like a top dog, like not a king, but a president that has, you know, strict things that they do. But we've got to have somebody who can act in times of crisis. We also need somebody who can be like the go-to person to deal with like other countries and stuff. So so they ended up creating the presidency through a convoluted system called the Electoral College, which I'm not going to go into detail on this lecture. We will talk about it in another one. I have a video that helps explain the Electoral College in a very clear, easy way, because it's designed for kids, but it's a fun video and it's dated because it's from just after the 2000 elections with Gore and Bush, but it still serves its purpose because nothing's changed in the Electoral College since then. So so we'll go over that when we talk more about the Electoral College. So once they got kind of the basics down, they realized that some groups would have issue with just, okay, like here are the definitions of the government, but we need, as individual citizens, like we really need to have something that lays out like our individual protections as citizens, not just here are the basics from the government. Like we need something more. We need the heart of the government. And so when they were getting some pushback about the Constitution, they decided that they would add a Bill of Rights, because, you know, the Articles of Confederation was largely like state control and in theory giving individuals more autonomy, but that's not ended up what happening because the states got a little power hungry. So they realized that that's what people really wanted. It's like, listen, we need to know that you're not going to screw us over like we feel Britain and the King did. So they promised a Bill of Rights to ensure that that would be the case. So the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments of the United States Constitution, ratified in 1791, ensuring certain rights and liberties to the people. So a lot of people think that all of the amendments, of which there are 27 to the Constitution, are the Bill of Rights, but they are not. Only the first 10, all right, just 10. So they instituted separation of powers and federalism to make sure that they didn't trample on individual rights. So separation of powers was the division of governmental power among several institutions that must cooperate in decision making. It's basically dividing up government powers into different groups. So like one or two people didn't like hold all of the say in the power, and you had to go through a process. And they also instituted federalism, which is a system of government in which power is divided by a constitution between central and regional governments. Central government would be federal level, regional would be like the states. So this is on your, oh no, that's what I meant to do. Sorry, I'm trying to move something out of the way so I can see it. I don't think you guys see that portion of my screen, but so on page 40, there is table 2.1, which compares the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. This is a great review for you guys so you understand the differences and the similarities between the two. So you can see, okay, here's where we started. Here's where we ended up. I'm not going to go through and read all of this. You guys are big boys and girls. You can read it. Like and you can kind of summarize it, right? We had no president in the articles, we did in the Constitution. We had no judicial system, but we did in the Constitution. We had a unicameral legislature where it was just like everybody got one vote, everybody had to agree, which didn't work, right? And so then they changed it to the bicameral legislature. So, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of follow along with that and see the differences. We just figured out that like our first draft was just not sufficient, that we needed to flesh it out and add more detail and take out what didn't work, right? Like when you're writing a paper, same general concept, but with much larger repercussions, right? So, any day. Okay. So, the Constitution was divided up, the branches of government. This is all about the checks and balances system again, right? So we have 3 different branches of government, which we'll talk about now. So the first branch that we're going to talk about is the legislative branch, which over time has definitely grown in power. Not nearly as much as the presidency, but we'll talk about all of that down the road in other chapters. So in Article 1 of the Constitution, it talks about Congress first. So that's considered the legislative branch. A lot of people get the term Congress mixed up. They think it's interchangeable with the House of Representatives or the Senate, like to describe just one of the bicameral portions of the legislature. But it's important to know that Congress, when you say Congress, you're talking about House and Senate, the 2 chambers of Congress. So those are the 2 chambers, and together they make up Congress. So I was actually very naive to that when I was younger, and I would call like the House of Representatives Congress. But a lot of House of Representatives members get aggravated or frustrated about that when people say that, because it's not accurate. They are just one part of the 2 parts of Congress. So so make sure that you understand that when you're seeing that kind of information. Yeah. Sorry, my cat is in here and he wanted to come and hang out, and now he's like, okay, I went out now because you're not paying attention to me. So anyways, the 2 chambers make up Congress. They staggered when they were up for re-election. And the reason for that is so that way it wasn't like all brand new people all at the exact same time coming in. So there was always somebody in the room that like had a little bit idea about the process. And so it just wouldn't be like too much overhaul all at once of the government. So, so the House gets reelected every 2 years, which seems like a whole lot, right? And then every 6 years in the Senate, which seems like not nearly often enough. So, and then the president is every 4 years. So they just did like 2, 4, 6. The reasons for that is the House of Representatives is from the population, right? And it's broken up by districts throughout the state. So in theory, the House of Representatives, it's over a smaller section of people, like, because it's just over like a portion of the state, right? Like each House of Representative, it's like just like, this little area in the Northwest Florida is like a district, and like here is a district. And so the idea is that because they are not over as large of an area of governance, that they're back at home more often. They're able to deal with their constituents on a more regular basis. Maybe not one-on-one, but like, in town hall settings, like they're more connected to the community at a local level. So in theory, they should be more engaged and accomplishing things in a local level more frequently and easier. And therefore shouldn't need as long to get things done. And if they can't get it done in 2 years, get replaced. So that's kind of the thought process behind the every 2 years. Give me like 2 seconds here. I'm going to pause and let the cat out because he's freaking out. Oh, the joys of working from home. So, all right. So I let him out. So that was the idea behind the House being able to be elected more often. And the Senate, we only have 2 senators for each state, and they're over the entire state. So it's a longer process for them to constantly work across the state to see what is needed for their constituents as a whole. They're representing a more diverse group of people, right? Like where in your district, it's going to be more homogenous and similar backgrounds, similar interests, where when you're representing an entire state, it's more heterogeneous, therefore has a larger array of people to represent. So it's a little bit more work in that way for the Senate. So they need more time to be able to do what needs to be done to represent a whole state. So that's part of the 6-year process. So the state was designed to guard against the excessive democracy. And the Senate, I think I said the Senate was designed for that. The Senate also was the only people given power to ratify treaties that the president makes and to approve any presidential appointments. So not the House, but the Senate. The House is given sole power to originate revenue bills. So when it comes to, the financial aspect on that. So, so they divided up the power, as it were. So one branch wasn't doing everything. And so one segment of that branch wasn't doing everything. So it was a little bit better that way. It divided it up for sure. So let's see. Also, the terms were staggered so that 1/3 of the senators would expire every 2 years. So, like a segment of senators would be on the ballot 2 years, and then another segment in their area in 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. So there are senators still being elected across the country every 2 years, but not all of the senators every 2 years, if that makes sense. So I always forget to mention that part. So I'm skimming here, making sure that I'm not missing anything. The power of the House was checked by that of the Senate, whose members were to be appointed by the states for longer terms rather than elected directly by the people for short ones. So originally the House was elected directly by the people, but the Senate was not. The Senate was actually state legislator appointments originally. It was not something that we voted on initially. Alexander Hamilton said the purpose of that was to avoid an unqualified person, can't pronounce that word, an unqualified person to every sudden breeze of passion or to every transient impulse which the people may receive, which was probably some good wisdom on his part, because I think we have seen enough now that sometimes that does happen in politics where, the citizens get their panties in a twist about something and they jump the gun, right? So this also said staggered terms in the Senate were intended to make the body more even more resistant to popular pressure. So that way they had longer to get the job done, because let's be honest, we have a short-term memory as a society. So with the Senate, if you do something at the beginning of your 6-year term, people have moved on from that by the time you're up for re-election, right? Unless the media or somebody else judges it up and brings it back to light, most people aren't going to be holding on to that and use it against you when there's so much that the Senate has to do on a larger scale. They have to think in bigger terms. Or with the House, it's more localized. And if the local area doesn't feel like their needs are being met by their House of Representatives, they have a much higher turnover. So let's see. Making sure I'm not missing anything. So, okay, let's go on to the next section here. Oh, come on. So again, Article 1 deals with the details of Congress. Section 8 of Article 1 lists the powers that Congress has. So Article 1 establishes Congress, like officially, and says, like, here's one of the branches of government that we shall have. It'll be bicameral, 6 years to, like, it lays all of that out. And then Section 8 of the article says, here's what Congress can do as a whole. So they can collect taxes, they can borrow money from other government entities, they can regulate commerce when necessary, they can declare war, and they can maintain an army and a navy. Now, as you notice, there's not a Marine Corps, Air Force, or any of that listed, or a Coast Guard, because those things didn't exist at the time, right? We had just Army and Navy. So, but it becomes implied and inferred based on the fact that it said Army and Navy, like all military forces. So I want to point out the fact that it says declare war. We'll talk about that more. So there's a whole chapter on just Congress. And so we'll talk in more detail at that time. But I want to point that out because a lot of people don't realize that Congress is the only branch of government that can actually declare war, not the president, which a lot of people don't realize that. The president can't formally declare war. However, so the president is the commander in chief of the armed forces. So they're like, top dog of the armed forces. So the military goes where the president tells them to go, even if he or she can't say, well, this is a war. It's like, oh, I'm sending you there. You're going to fight like it's a war. It certainly acts like a war, but we can't throw war onto it unless Congress declares it an official war. So Congress in theory could push back and say, hey, we did not declare war on this. You can't be sending them over there like that. And since they're the ones who maintain the military, they're the ones who approve budgets and make sure there's funding there for all items necessary to maintain a military. So that's equipment, that's military bases, that's gear of any and all kind, that's weaponry, right? So what do you think is going to happen when a president sends troops, even though Congress is like, don't do that? You think they're not going to send them supplies? Of course they are, because they get elected. So they still got to worry about their jobs. And the public would say, well, I don't care. Okay, fine. The president shouldn't have done that, but don't take that out on the troops. So we'll talk about that in depth a little bit more when we get to the presidency and the Congress chapters. So one of the things that's also listed are the types of powers. So the first is what we refer to as express powers, which are specific powers granted by the Constitution to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, and to the President in Article 2. So, and then there's implied powers, which are not, so like the express powers, like it lays it out, like you can declare war, you can do like those are express powers, like that's like the Constitution verbatim says do these things. Implied powers are known as like doing what you got to do to get the job done. Like that's a real layman's way to put it. So your book says implied powers come from necessary and proper clause, also known as the elastic clause of the Constitution. So the concluding paragraph of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, also known as the necessary and proper clause, which provides Congress with the authority to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out its enumerated powers. So again, doing whatever you got to do to get the job done. Like, okay, so the government, like, so the Constitution says that we are to maintain an army and a navy, but it doesn't say how. So the elastic clause says implement what we have to be able to achieve the express powers. So, okay, so to maintain an army, we need budgets. We need to approve a certain dollar amount for certain things. We need to build like branches, right? Like we need to put some people in charge of that. So like those like in the weeds details happen under the implied powers to make sure the express powers can be achieved. Does that make sense? So just like it says, collect taxes. Okay, well, how do you collect taxes? IRS, right? Like, okay, we'll collect taxes by taxing everybody's paychecks, and the IRS will be the entity to manage it. And people will file taxes every year, and that way we'll know how much people are making and what we need to get and what we need to give back that we took too much of. So like those, like that's the implied, right? It says you collect taxes. Okay, but how do we collect taxes? And so then they have to create systems to make that happen. So that's the first branch of government is Congress. So now Article 2 of our lovely Constitution says, okay, so we need a head cheese, a head honcho. We need a top guy or gal. So they decided to create a presidency. And so the express powers of the presidency list that the president can negotiate treaties with other countries as long as the Senate approves those treaties. Remember, that's like listed sooner. They can receive ambassadors from other countries, like other countries can say, I would like to appoint this person as an ambassador to your country as a liaison. And the president can like kind of deal with that ambassador. The president can also grant pardons for people who have been accused / convicted of things. Like the president has the authority to waive that and say, hey, I'm letting you off. A lot of people do it for like low level offenses. There's like a petition process that people can petition the president to pardon folks, like maybe low level drug crime, like, oh, they've been doing 20 years for, you know, a couple grams of pot or something, right? They can appoint department personnel, which we'll talk about departments in more detail later, but it's just part of the executive branch and the way things are divvied up to like make sure all the jobs are done, like that need to be done in government. And they can veto Congress law. So Congress, House and the Senate can, you know, agree and put something forward to become a law. And then it goes to the president's desk to sign it. And the president has the option to reject it or to approve it. And when he rejects it, it's called a veto. And when we get further into the book, there's a whole section about how a bill becomes a law and the process in which it happens. I also have a lovely video of that. So when we get to that point. So that's the executive branch in a nutshell. And then of course, implied powers are, okay, how do you get those items accomplished? So, and then Article 3, now remember, the only thing that was established under the Articles of Confederation was a Congress, but nothing like the Congress that ended up being created in the Constitution. But the presidency and the judicial branch were brand new under the Constitution. Those did not exist under the previous government. So Article 3 creates a judicial branch, and that's not just the Supreme Court. That's justices of all levels. You know, we've got county judges, we've got district judges, state judges, federal judges, and, you know, then the Supreme Court. And we'll dive into that in more detail later on in the book when we talk about the federal court chapter. So they do specifically list the Supreme Court as being an entity to be created under the judicial branch. So they did realize there needs to be like a top kind of review of things. The judicial branches have the power to resolve conflicts between federal and state law. The Supreme Court does. So like if there's confusion on what is valid, then it goes before the Supreme Court. Federal judges, and that's all federal judges because they're like federal district judges and things like that aren't just the Supreme Court, are given lifetime appointments. So that's something that a lot of people say, I don't know about all that, but we'll talk in more detail about why later. Your book mentions one of the reasons. It helps avoid political pressure and interference from other branches for them to be appointed, not elected. So they're not beholden to worrying about keeping their job. They can just worry about doing their job, if that makes sense. And we'll talk about that in more detail later. And then the Supreme Court has the authority for what's known as judicial review, which is the power of the courts to review actions of the legislative and executive branches, and if necessary, declare them invalid or unconstitutional. This was actually, this arrived from sort of an implied power. It was not specifically listed in the Constitution, but it was derived from the court case Marbury v. Madison in 1803. So in that case, they don't talk about it in detail until later here. So drives me crazy when they list something, but then they don't talk about it until, like later on. Let's see if I can find it. No, it's gotta be further back. Okay, so in 1803, there was a case called Marbury v. Madison. This arose after Thomas Jefferson succeeded John Adams as president. Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to deliver an official commission to William Marbury, who had been appointed to a minor office by Adams and approved by the Senate just before Adams left the presidency. So kind of sticking him with this new guy, which Madison was not happy about. Marbury petitioned the Supreme Court to order Madison to deliver the commission. Jefferson and his allies did not believe that the court had the power to issue such an order and might have resisted it. Chief Justice John Marshall was determined to assert the power of the judiciary, but wanted to avoid a direct confrontation with the president. Accordingly, he turned down Marbury's petition, but gave as his reason the unconstitutionality of the legislation upon which Marbury had based his claim. Thus, Marshall asserted the power of judicial review, but did so in a way that would not provoke a battle with Jefferson. The Supreme Court's decision in this case established the power of judicial review. And it hasn't really been questioned since 1803. Like, people have just been like, okay. One reason is that the Supreme Court makes a self-conscious effort to give acts of Congress an interpretation that will make them constitutional. For example, in its 2012 decision upholding the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, the court agreed with many legal scholars who had argued that Congress had no power under the Constitution's Commerce Clause to order Americans to purchase health insurance. But rather than invalidate the act, the court declared that the law's requirement that all Americans purchase insurance was actually a tax, and thus represented a constitutionally accepted use of Congress's power to levy taxes. What a workaround, right? So, so the Supreme Court basically gave themselves judicial review to help them do their job that the Constitution empowered them to do. So, my nose itches. So the judicial branch was also designed to be a check on too much democracy, to make sure that the other two branches didn't get too big for their britches. So, oh, excuse me. So this figure is really great, figure 2.1. It's on page 45. It shows separation of powers. So it shows you what you can do, what each branch can do rather, and what they focus on. So I won't read all of these again, like it's what we just went over, but this is a great visual instead of like, if you need more of a visual, these are a fantastic way to do that. I also have all of the PowerPoints that you'll see in the lectures are listed under each module under I actually don't remember what section of the modules, so I apologize for that, but I'm completely blanking on where I have it listed. But if you go under, say, module 1 and you click on each of the sections, one of the sections has each of the PowerPoints. So like if you want to go back and like, you know, print a particular slide or something like that, like you can pull it up. I've got them saved, and then you can, you know, do what you need to like for your studying. So like for me, these sort of like breakouts that the book puts together, those are the sort of items that like I always liked, because it gave you like a quick one-page study guide of that particular topic. So I found that really helpful when I was a student. So it would be helpful for you to, you know, like say print this particular page. Like if you're building your own study guide or need something that is very specific, like these sort of visuals can help with that. So just a little tidbit for you that might be helpful. Come on. So under the new Constitution, they focused a lot on unity on a national level and authority, and how to dole it out in as fair yet efficient way as possible. So there were a lot of different provisions in the Constitution to sort of quell any concerns that people had. Article 4 provides for reciprocity among states, where each state could not discriminate against citizens of other states. And we'll talk about that in more detail later. It also restricted powers of the states to ensure free-flowing national economy. So federal government basically took over the economy as a whole. And the Constitution also said that it was top dog for all laws. Like it was the supreme law of the land. It's literally known as the Supremacy Clause. In Article 6 of the Constitution, it states laws passed by the national government and all treaties are the supreme law of the land and superior to all laws adopted by any state or any subdivision. It also talks about how the Constitution, which is something passed, you know, by the national government, that no laws on any level can conflict with the Constitution. Like if it doesn't line up with the Constitution, then it's an invalid law. And then one step further from that, like a state can't, like, so, you know, the Constitution establishes that there can be no state, you know, government organized religion. So like if Florida decided to say, hey, Florida's state religion is Baptist, that would be in direct conflict with the Constitution and therefore would be invalid. Same with the federal government. They couldn't do something like that because again, it would be in direct conflict with the Constitution. So, so there you go. That shows how they're the supreme law of the land. So you need to keep a note on that as well. So let's see. So we're on page 44. Let's see, where are we at? So the founders wanted to make sure that power was not abused and that people did not like vie for too much power, that there were like balances across the board. So they included several different checks on the government. Separation of powers, like I talked about before, each branch checks each other's and they all have different roles on how to do that. And they also represented different people to who they were responsible for to get their job done. Federalism was also instituted to draw clear lines of distinction between the national and state governments. And then the Bill of Rights was created to make sure that it placed more limits on what the government could do to protect individual freedoms and liberties for the citizens themselves. So this is a great little pull out for you as well in the book, page 46. For checks and balances. So this is helpful, like if you need to kind of see, okay, like who checks who on this. You don't have to know, like, I'm not going to say, you know, like, I don't know. I can't even give an example right now, but I'm not going to ask you in a way of this. Like you might be asked, like, who declares laws unconstitutional? Like you would need to know that that's the judicial branch, which we'll get to later. You wouldn't be asked that like in the first one or whatever. Like who can veto acts of Congress? Like who's the branch that can declare war, right? Like those are the types of questions that you'll be asked, more than like who can shut that down, more like who's the only one who can do that. Because it gets very confusing with like, okay, this branch can stop this branch. So you won't be seeing it quite like that. Gosh, I'm so sorry, guys. I'm probably aggravating this too out of all of you watching this going, gosh, she's making me tired. So, so during all of this process, the Constitution also established a process on how to make amendments. So that way, like they understood that the odds were society would change and grow over time. And so there needed to be room to be able to add to the Constitution if need be. So, so that's how they did that. That's how we also got the first 10 amendments, which became known as the Bill of Rights. So they set forth rules for ratifying the Constitution itself. So the rules for ratification or adoption of the Constitution are set forth in Article 7. Of the 13 states, 9 would have to ratify it in order for it to go into effect. And that's the same sort of system with like making changes. It's like 3/4 or something like that. So there were two groups of people, like schools of thought on like getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and establishing the Constitution. So there were a group called the Federalists, and they were all for it. They were like, yeah, man, like what we have is simply not working. We need a stronger system. So the definition was those who favored a strong national government and supported the Constitution proposed at the American Constitution Convention of 1787. So they wanted a stronger government and they were very united in supporting the Constitution, to the point that a group of people wrote what's known as Federalist Papers, which I had mentioned earlier, which some are in the back of the book, as to the why they were in support of it. So it says the best known pieces in support were 85 articles published in New York City newspapers by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. The Federalist Papers, as they're known today, defended the principles of the Constitution and sought to dispel fears of a strong national government. But anti-federalists, who were the other school of thought who were not in favor of the Constitution, that was including Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee, argued in their speeches and writings that the new Constitution betrayed the revolution, was a step toward monarchy. So they wanted more of what we had in the Articles of Confederation, a stronger state government, weaker decentralized national government. And like they knew that the articles weren't really working but they really did not like the direction the Constitution was going. So then it was kind of like a back and forth, like, well, what can we do to get these anti-federalists on board with this ratification, because the articles are simply not working. So these were the three issues that they struggled with, and they could not get on board and on the same page with each other. So how can people be represented effectively? So did representatives need to be precisely like those people who they represented, or did they need to just understand the system and be able to like make the right sort of choices? So let me see. Anti-Federalists asserted that representatives must be a true picture of the people, possessing knowledge of their circumstances and their wants. But this could only be achieved in small republics such as each existing state, where people were relatively similar. In their view, size and diversity of population of the entire nation made a truly representative form of government impossible. Federalists saw no reason that representatives should be precisely like those represented. In their view, one of the great advantages of representative government over direct democracy was precisely the possibility that the people who would choose the individuals with experience and talent greater than their own to represent them. In Madison's words, rather than mirroring society, representatives must be those who possess the most wisdom to discern and the most virtue to pursue the common good of the society. So they had very large differences on like who would be these elected officials, basically. Tyranny was the next thing. Was tyranny more likely to stem from a gradual shift to aristocracy or from the majority? So anti-federalists were worried that our government would become more aristocratic, with members of the small group in authority using their positions to gain more and more power over other citizens. They feared the few would tyrannize the many, but Federalists viewed the danger particularly associated not as aristocracy, but as tyranny over the few by the many. They feared that a popular majority, united and actuated by some common impulse of passion and or interest adverse to the rights of other citizens, would trample on the rules of justice. So, and the definition of tyranny is oppressive government that employs cruel and unjust use of power and authority. So they just did not agree on what made basically an unjust government. And then the third thing was government power. Should the national government have strict limits or broader powers? And so they just could not agree on these issues. Sorry. So this is on page 48, table 2.2. This is great because you will be asked to compare Federalists and Anti-Federalists in one of your exams. I believe it's the one next week. Yes, because chapter 3 is the federalism chapter. So you need to be familiar with this. You need to know who was who. So Federalists were the top level kind of tier of our society: property owners, merchants, creditors. Anti-Federalists were your salt of the earth folks, your small farmers, your shopkeepers, your debtors, that kind of thing. Federalists believed in a larger, more strong government. They felt like elites would be the most fit to govern because they were generally more educated, more in tune with things, and they were very much afraid of excessive democracy, where it'd be kind of a free-for-all crapshoot, like it was under the Articles. But Anti-Federalists felt like the government should be closer to the people, and they worried that concentration of power would go into the hands of the elites who didn't understand the struggle of the day-to-day person. Federalists, again, wanted stronger government. Anti-Federalists wanted stronger state rights. And then here are some of the people who were Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. So let's see, I already talked about that. All right. So this says, debates over how much power the national government should have continue today. After the San Bernardino shooting in 2015, the FBI demanded Apple unlock the perpetrator's iPhone for details into his criminal activity. Here, a group protests the FBI's infringement on the right to privacy. So, so the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were just complete opposites in the way they felt like the government should be designed. And so they knew that they needed a limit of powers in the government, but they couldn't agree on how, right? So Anti-Federalists did not want a strong federal/central government. They wanted a weaker one with limited specified powers, and you don't step outside of that. And they wanted a Bill of Rights. The Federalists wanted a stronger central government because they felt like we were not prepared for Shays' Rebellion and that it could have been a lot worse. And they wanted divided powers to prevent tyranny of the majority, to help provide that limited government. So like the three branches of government was kind of their solution to it. They also didn't feel like the Bill of Rights was needed because they felt like it was clear enough in the Constitution. But what ended up happening was, okay, the Federalists ended up winning enough to, be able to change it and to create the Constitution. But to ease the concerns of the Anti-Federalists, they did end up implementing the Bill of Rights. So they did create a stronger national government under the Constitution. But a lot of people are still afraid of that strong national government. Like that Anti-Federalist viewpoint is still like rampant among society even today. So they created the Bill of Rights as a like throwing a dog a bone sort of thing for the Anti-Federalists. And it's so good that they did, because it's like in a lot of ways, some of the most powerful portions of the Constitution. So both ended up contributing to the success of the system because of that compromise that was warranted. So figure 2.3 here talks about ways that the Constitution can be amended. So there's 4 different ways. Your book lists those out, and then it also, it also gives this chart as well. So it says if you need to change the Constitution, it has to pass both the House and the Senate with 2/3 of the vote. Then by the majority vote of the legislators of 3/4 of the states. So that's 38 states. So like House and Senate, 2/3 of them have to vote to do it. Then they have to send it to the states, and then 3/4 of the states have to say yes. In 9 cases, Congress demanded a time limit for state ratification, so it just couldn't sit on the clock, for like forever, because the state never gets around to voting for it. Passage in House and Senate by 2/3 of a vote, then ratification by conventions called for the purpose in the 3/4 of the states, or passage in a national convention called for by Congress in response to petitions by 2/3 of the states, then ratification by majority vote of the legislators of 3/4 of those states. Passage in a national convention, then ratification by conventions called for the purpose in a 3/4 of the states. So those are like the different ways that the Constitution can be amended. So the figure 2.3 is on page 52 for those of you who want to see that in your book. So who participates is on page 53. So it says who gained the right to vote through amendments. Basically anybody that was not a land-owning white male is how that ended up working. So the right to vote is seen as a cornerstone of American democracy, but not all Americans have had that right. The 3 constitutional amendments ratified over roughly 100 years have had a profound effect on who can vote in US elections. So in national elections as of 1789, it was only white men of property, and they had to be 21 and older. So just under 28% of the population. By 1869, all men 21 or older could, so that brings it up to 30, almost 32%. And then 1920, now women can also vote. So all men and women 21 and older. That jumps up to 92.6% of the population can now vote. Not until 1920 when women were granted the right. Don't even get me started, y'all. And then in 1971, the voting age got lowered to 18. And it's funny, the voting age only got lowered to 18 because there were protests about the Vietnam War, because that's when this was going on. And people said it wasn't right that people couldn't vote, but they could go and die for their country. They were pushing to raise the draft age to 21, but the government said, I'll see you're wanting to raise that to 21 and I'll raise you, we'll just let you vote at 18. So they still drafted people at 18, but then said, yeah, okay, if you can die for our country, I guess you can vote for it too. So that happened in 1971. And then in 2018, you can see how many people of those different segments actually turned out and vote. So more women, 53% of women were who voted in 2018. Like 53% of the vote were women. So, and then 25.5% were African American, Latino, and Asian men. And then people 18 to 20, 1.1%. Sad. If you were in that like 18 to 20 range and you did not vote, I'm gonna need you to step it up. Like, it's so vitally important for you to not only be registered to vote, but to also partake in voting as well. So, okay, so there's that. Just seeing where we are. We're almost done, guys. So this gives you a kind of a close-up breakdown. So table 2.3, which is on, sorry, I'm trying to get it where I can read it. Okay, on pages 54 and 55, this shows all of the amendments to the Constitution. All right, so Amendment 1, this is the one everybody likes to quote, right? This is your freedom of speech, your freedom of religion, your freedom to assemble, freedom of the press, all of that. So Amendment 1, Congress is not to make any law establishing a religion or abridging free exercise of religion, speech, press, assembly, or petitioning the government for redress of grievances. So that's all Amendment 1. Now, Articles 2, 3, and 4. Article 2, or I'm sorry, Amendments 2, 3, and 4. Amendment 2, everybody knows about Second Amendment rights, right? Like, people love to talk about their Second Amendment rights. So it says no branch of government may infringe on the right of the people to keep arms, is not arbitrarily to occupy homes for a militia. Because used to, like, they could like knock on the door, like, listen, we're coming through for this area of battle, like we need to crash on your couch. And is not to engage in the search or seizure of evidence without a court warrant swearing to belief in the probable existence of a crime. And of course, we will talk about these amendments in a lot more detail when we get to chapters 4 and 5. So amendments 5, 6, 7, and 8, doesn't that make you want to like do a dance number? 5, 6, 7, 8. Just me? Okay. So this states that the courts are not to hold trials for serious offenses without provision of a grand jury. So that's Amendment 5. So that is well, I plead the fifth, right? Like, you might have ever heard that, like, I plead the fifth, like the fifth amendment, basically like unless I'm before a grand jury, I ain't talking. Like, you can't do anything to me. Like, you can't hold me accountable for something, like, unless you're gonna put me in front of a court. Like, so I'm just gonna shut up. I can plead the fifth and shut my mouth. Let's see, 6 is that you are allowed to have a speedy trial. You're allowed to be told what you're being charged with. You're allowed to confront witnesses or / accusers. And then 7 is that you are entitled to have like a jury of your peers, right? Also more for 5, immunity from testifying against oneself. I plead the fifth, so I'm gonna shut up so I don't get myself in trouble. Immunity for more than one trial for the same offense. Can't be charged for the exact same crime twice. Like if you're accused of, murder in the first degree and you're acquitted, they find more evidence later. Okay, well, we can't acquit you for that, but we can get you for like, second degree murder or, manslaughter or something. So you can go back to court over the issue, but you can't be charged in the same exact way. So it's kind of tricky. Let's see, neither bail nor punishment can be excessive. That is the 8th portion. And we'll get into that one in a little bit more detail, but when you hear people who are opponents of the death penalty, they specifically look to the 8th Amendment and they say they believe the punishment is excessive. And then also under Amendment 5, no property can be taken away without just compensation. They can take it, but they have to pay you for it. And we'll talk about that in more detail as well. Amendments 9 and 10 limit specifically on the national government. All rights and powers not enumerated above, basically, are reserved to the rights of the people. So basically they're saying, okay, if it's not listed, then the states deal with it, right? So number 11 is that there's limited jurisdiction of federal courts over suits involving the states. 12 is providing a separate ballot for vice president in the electoral college. 13 is getting rid of slavery and to give them the right to have property. Amendment 14 is the principle of national citizenship and prohibiting the states from infringing upon the rights of citizens of the nation, no matter that they happen to live in that state. Also prohibited states from denying voting rights to male citizens over 21. 15 is giving the right to vote to all races. Okay, like it was white men with property. Now it's men of all color after slavery was ended. And then 16, establish national power to tax incomes. So that was how they got the, well, how are we going to collect taxes things? So they had to do that amendment. 17 was provide direct election of senators. Remember, originally that was not, what was done. And the little note down here says the 18th Amendment ratified in 1920 outlawed the sale and transportation of liquor. It was repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. So that's why you see there's like a skip. Like it goes from 17 to 19. So 18 is like no longer. So it's been ratified 27 times, but we only have 26 still on the books. So 19 is extending the right of voting rights to women. That was in 1920. The 20th Amendment is eliminating lame duck sessions of Congress. 22 is, so that's why you don't see the 21st, because it repealed the 18th. The 22nd officially limited presidential terms. So George Washington stepped down like voluntarily to show like, one, we should always have a peaceful transfer of power, and 2, this is a really hard job and we don't need to just stay in. And that's kind of what a king does too. We need to make sure like fresh ideas are coming in and that like, we're not having a dictatorial system. So, so everybody had served like 1 or 2 terms, nobody more than 2 because of the precedent set by Washington. But when World War II happened, people are very uncomfortable with changing leadership in the middle of a crisis like that. So they wanted to keep re-electing FDR. So he actually served, I don't think it was a full 3rd term, but he was elected for a 3rd term. And he had all those health issues and stuff. And it was just too much on him. And he was like, this should never happen again. This should not be the case to anybody. So so he actually appealed to the Congress and was like, listen, this straight up does not need to happen. anymore. We need to make sure that like people are taking care of themselves. Like this is just entirely too much. So they officially limited the presidential term to 2 years, where before it was unlimited, like the House and the Senate. The 23rd Amendment extended voting rights to DC. And that's a mess. DC being the capital of the United States, was Philadelphia originally, and then it got moved to DC, and then they couldn't even vote. Like, what? The 29th Amendment was the 24th Amendment extended voting rights to all classes by abolishing poll taxes. Some people believe that requiring a photo ID to vote is still a form of a poll tax. And we'll go into detail about that in another lecture. 25 provided presidential succession in case of a disability, because we had had some assassination attempts, we had some actual assassinations, and people were like, what do we do in case something happens to the president? So that's when they formally said, okay, like it's the vice president and it's this person, and then it's this person and it's this person. And it just goes down the line. And then the 26th Amendment extended the voting right for people 18 and over. I enjoy the 27th Amendment so much, and here's why. So the 27th Amendment limits Congress's power to raise its own salary. Fun note, that was one of the first amendments that was put forward as a suggestion to Congress. It was sitting there for over 200 years before one of the congressional groups finally took it up and was like, yeah, we probably should not just like, give ourselves raises of whatever amount whenever we want. And so they finally voted to do it. But all of those other groups were like, hell no, I don't want my pocketbook affected. Like, I am not going to be that good of a person. So I just always think it's funny that like it took to the 90s, like 1990s, before it was actually done, because they did not want to limit their own earning potential, basically. So I always get a kick out of that. I think it's pretty funny. So, okay, so those are all the amendments. Now, before I get into the public opinion poll, remember I told you guys for chapter 1 that I always like the what do you think section, like the Constitution, like the what do you think at the very end of the chapter. And I also like to go over the chapter goals, which we hit all of those. Explain the conflicts and coalitions that led to the Declaration of Independence and Articles of Confederation. We did that. Describe the political context of the Constitutional Convention and the compromise achieved there. We did that. Describe the principles of governance and the powers of the national government defined by the Constitution. We did that. Differentiate between the Federalist and anti-Federalist stances on the ratification of the Constitution. We did that too. Explain how and how often the Constitution has been changed. And we just did that. So this is interesting at the end. So this little section talks about Jim Obergefell. I never say his name right. He fought to secure marriage equality for same-sex couples. It illustrates the way in which the Constitution structure shapes politics to this day. The framers placed individual liberty ahead of all other political values. They feared that democracy could degenerate into a tyranny of the majority. They feared that economic or social equality would inspire the have-nots to interfere with the liberty of the haves, because they were the haves. They had the money, so they were worried about that. As a result, they designed many of the constitutional key provisions, such as separated powers, internal checks and balances, and federalism to safeguard liberty, and designed others, such as indirect election of senators and the president and the appointment of judges for life, to limit democracy and the threat of majority tyranny. By championed liberty, however, the framers virtually guaranteed that democracy and even a measure of equality would eventually come to the United States. Liberty promotes political activity and participation, encouraging people and groups to fight for their rights and interests. In doing so, they may achieve greater equality, as did Jim Obergefell, featured at the beginning of this chapter. So his entire story of what he did and how he did it is at the very beginning of the chapter on page 28 and 29. So I highly recommend, like, don't skip over like that beginning section. It's pretty incredible. So so the questions are, what do you think about the values of liberty, equality, and democracy? Which is the most important to you? Which do you think is the most important to Jem? How might your life be different if you lived in a country with different commitments to these values? Advocates arguing for a particular policy position often invoke cherished values such as liberty, equality, and democracy to support their positions. What kinds of arguments could both supporters and opponents of same-sex marriage make using these three values? Are there policy areas where you are frustrated by the slow policy-making process created by the separation of powers and system of checks and balances? All the time. Or policy areas where you were relieved that changes that you opposed were slowed or halted? How do you think Jem would answer these questions? So these, again, are a great way to apply what you just learned about chapter 2 into sort of like real world scenarios. So, and as always, I highly recommend doing the study guide at the end of your chapter on pages 57, 58, and 59. And remember, like I said in chapter 1, you will see some of these questions again. So you would be a fool not to review them. So make sure that you review them. So, okay, now I'm going to go over the public opinion poll with you guys. So public opinion question number 1. Do you believe the US Constitution done in 1787 was driven more by noble principles or more by political self-interest? A, driven primarily by noble principles. B, driven primarily by political self-interest. C, a mix of noble principles and political self-interest. Give you guys a second to think about that. You got it? Hopefully you agreed with C. There were some like truly, you know, just for the good of the whole noble principles, but there's a lot of political self-interest too. Like I just mentioned, that they were afraid that the haves would be tyrannized by the have-nots. And unfortunately, it's been the opposite in a lot of situations. So there's definitely like a mix of them wanting to do something that benefited them, but they also had their hearts in the right place in some arenas as well. Public opinion poll question 2. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists disagreed about what most influenced elected officials and their policy choices. What do you think has the most influence on the kinds of laws elected officials support? A, their desire to get reelected or hold higher office. B, their personal wealth or economic class. C, their personal opinions and feelings about the issues. What do you guys think? I honestly believe that it depends on the elected official. I really think it depends on the person. You know, like some are going to like want to, you know, line their personal pockets. Some are going to be so passionate about particular issues that they're just going to vote like their own gut and their own feelings on it. And then some of them are just trying to make sure that they climb the ladder and that they keep their jobs. And sometimes this can all be wrapped up in the same elected official, depending on the matter, right? So, and then, you know, you would hope some of it would be just altruistic, like for the good of the world, but alas, that is not always the case. Public opinion poll question 3. Do you think we have different kinds of laws, or would have different kinds of laws, if elected officials had the same economic background as their average constituents as the Anti-Federalists wanted? A, yes, our laws would be different if elected officials had the same income as their constituents. B, no, our laws would be the same no matter the income similarity or difference between elected officials and those they represent. What do you guys think? I am gonna go with A. That's how I personally feel. I think a lot of elected officials who have been reelected and reelected are definitely not in the same financial spot as their constituents. And so a lot of times that makes it difficult for them to be able to connect and understand what their constituents are going through, because it's really difficult to understand what that struggle is if you don't have that struggle. When Mitt Romney was running for president, he spoke at a college, and one of the things he was talking about to the students was that they could be anything they wanted to be. They just had to have the right gumption. They just had to go after it. And he gave the example of, like, if you want to start your own business, like, do what you got to do. Like, even if like you need to go to your parents and, like you need to, borrow like $500,000 to get started, like do that. And it was like the most tone deaf thing you could say to people, because one, most people do not have $500,000 laying around to loan to their kids. And two, that shows the upbringing that he had. So how are you going to govern like the average person who has a ton of debt, who had to do student loans for stuff, who has to do loans for everything, because nobody in their family has money to like help them in that way, because he comes from money? Like, how is he ever going to be able to connect with the general public to be able to support them and advocate for them appropriately as president, when he didn't even realize how tone deaf that was? So yeah. Public opinion question 4. Small and large states compromise significantly on the structure of the government. How do you think these compromises have affected the balance of power between small and large states? A, small states have too much influence on government. B, large states have too much influence on government. C, there's a proper balance in power between the small and large states. I think the bicameral Congress legislator works really well to make sure it's balanced, like C suggests. I actually have a friend who hates the idea of states, and he feels that it should, like, all states should be abolished, and we should be like just like one country, like you see like in Europe. The problem is like Italy is the size of, like some of our states, and so that makes it difficult because we have such a larger area to cover. So it makes it difficult. I mean, you look at like every other continent and every other country, and like look at Central and South America. Okay, like they're huge. It's a huge continent, but it's not just one country. It's like multiple countries, where we just did like one country, but a ton of states, where a lot of people would say, well, maybe it should have been like different countries or something. So some people feel like maybe like the initial setup with the states, it was because it's not in alignment with like really what else you see in the world. But for the system that we have, I think the bicameral legislator really helps give that accurate balance. So public opinion poll question 5, considering the current number of amendments to the US Constitution, the number of amendments that have failed, which are 100 plus. Let me look up the number real quick. I'm not going to bother to get out of the screen. I'm just going to handy dandy phone it real quick. So let me see. How many amendments have been proposed? Thank you, Google. From 1789 through January 3rd, 2019, Google just let me down. Hold on. Let me try this again. It like just totally blanked out at me. How many amendments have been proposed? My phone just like did not want to cooperate. How many amendments have been tried? Just asking a different question. That's so weird. Google is like not working at all right now for me. I don't know what's happening, but it showed like 1,000 something before Google acted up. So let me finish the public opinion poll, and then I will look it up real quick before we dismiss. So, but we had a lot of attempted ones. So with the stability of our Constitution, Do you believe the process for amending the Constitution is too difficult, about right, or too easy? I always get kind of a weird mixture of answers for this question. I think it's just about right, because I don't think it should be so easy to amend that it can be done on a whim of like, society just being weird and pissy about something, you know what I mean? Like, and push our constituents, or I'm sorry, our elected officials into something that really isn't good for the longevity of our society. So I don't think it should be too easy. And I don't necessarily think it's too hard, because I think we have passed like some big stuff. Maybe it's a little too difficult. Maybe it should be a smidge easier, maybe. But I really feel like it's about right, because I don't think it's more difficult. I think the elected officials are too difficult. I don't know that the ratification process is difficult so much as it is the gridlock we have from the petulant, childish bickering that happens between the political parties. I think that has made everything, gridlocked and more difficult in our government, more than like the specific amendment process. I think the process itself is probably where it should be. So this is also something in your book, America Side by Side, Different Democratic Systems, and shows you kind of how they're laid out. So that's kind of a cool visual for you guys to kind of get an idea of how people, like the types of systems that people choose to use in their respective countries. And so that's like the end of the extra slide. So what I'm going to do real quick, I don't know what is happening with my phone for Google, but let's see if it works on my computer. How many amendments have been proposed? Come on, Google. There we go. So approximately, let me go back here. Where did it go? Where's my Zoom? Zoom. Let's go back here. No, that's not what I want. No. Oh, goodness. Sorry, guys. I almost ended the whole session. Okay, let me do a share screen real quick and I'll show you guys what it says here. Okay. All right, share. So it says, according to Wikipedia, which I don't ever recommend using as like a true like citation source when you're researching things, but for the purposes of this, approximately 11,770 things have been proposed to amend the Constitution. Members of the House and Senate typically propose around 200 amendments each 2-year term of Congress. We've only done 27, so that's a lot, but like some of this stuff is like nonsense things that just don't make sense. And a lot of things people try to tag onto the Constitution, when instead of being like in the Constitution, it should be a bill or a law, right? And so that's part of why we don't have 11,000 amendments to the Constitution. It's more because we just don't need as much. So you can get, if you want a more accurate one, here's some more legitimate sites. Senate.gov, 11,848 measures have been amended. So see, that number isn't quite accurate on Wikipedia. And then archivesfoundation.org, more than 11,000. So that way they don't have to change it every time there's one little one. But so for the exact number, like Senate.gov gives that to us. So that way you can see, where we're at with that. So, so we've gone through chapter 2. Woohoo, yay, another chapter down. So like I said at the beginning of the class, you guys are like doing really good about already getting assignments going. I think that's phenomenal. Most of the class have like gotten stuff in, and all of you who have submitted work have already gotten through chapter 1. So like that's like blowing my mind, because I'll be honest, I expected just a few things to trickle in until the end of the week, and then like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I'd be having a lot of grading and a lot of checking to do. And you guys are like rock, like you're not procrastinators. I don't even know how to connect to you right now, because like that was not me as a student. Like I waited to the 11th hour and then I just panicked and had anxiety until I like plowed through it all, which I don't recommend. It's not healthy, right? It's not like you guys are definitely choosing the better option. So that's fantastic. Please keep on doing that. If you have any questions about chapter 2, about this particular chapter, as always, feel free to let me know. If you need to meet by Zoom or whatever, we can definitely do that. Read the chapter, watch this lecture, which hopefully you've done by now since you're at the end. You didn't fast forward to the end. Do the study guides and the book, that kind of thing. All of that will help you. It will also help you to do those things before you go and take the quiz. And all of this together will help you ace the first exam next week, which will open up on Monday, and you'll have like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday till 11:59 at night to do it. And once you log in to do it, you'll have an hour. So, and I will get the study guide up in the next day or so. So that way, because most of you have not finished all the other work, so you're not even to the point of studying yet. So, but I will have the study guide up like by Friday-ish. I'm hoping tomorrow, but it might be Friday, just kind of depending on how the schedule works out. Yeah, I might work on it tomorrow because actually Friday's an incredibly full day, so I might try and get it done Thursday. But you guys will definitely have it before the exam opens, obviously, and I won't be that person who gives it to you, like Sunday night, and then you're like cramming on Monday. So you will have it the next day or two, and then you'll have time to like review that. So if you have any questions about this or any of the other stuff that you're going over, please feel free to let me know. I know a few of you have asked if it's going to be open book, open note. It will not be, but you shouldn't need it to be, mostly because if you do it the way I've got it set up, if you watch the lectures, you read the book, you do the study guide, you do the quizzes, those are all reviews for the exam. Plus I'm giving you a study guide, and the study guide is very clear. It's basically the questions reformatted into here's what you need to study so you know what's on the exam. So if you do all of those things, you won't need your book or your notes. Again, I mentioned it in the chapter 1 lecture, and I will email it to you guys as well. But please, please, please make sure that you know how to operate Respondus, because you'll be required to do that when you go to take your exam next week. So, and if you have any other questions, feel free to let me know, and we will talk soon. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.